Welcome to Resolving Reality Radio, back with another episode in the interview series. You can find us on several platforms, YouTube, we're on X at ResolvingOr, also Rumble, Odysee, and the email for the show is contactoror@protonmail.com. All the links for those will be down in the description. In this episode, I'm speaking to a returning guest, David Walsh from Men's Voices Ireland, and I spoke to David in the first episode of Resolving Reality Radio back in 2018. We spoke about several issues affecting men and boys in Ireland, so definitely check out that interview, preferably first before you listen to this one. The website for Men's Voices Ireland is mensvoicesireland.com. You can also find them on X at mensvoices_IRL. The links for those will be down in the description. Good afternoon, David, and welcome back to the show.
Good afternoon, Emmett, and thank you for having me.
No worries. Great to have you back. It's a long time since our last chat. So since I've gotten back into it recently after such a long break, it's nice and symbolic that you're here. So I do have recommended to the listeners, the viewers, to go back and listen to the first show we did back in 2018. It's got some great information in there. But obviously, let's just cater to those who won't do that because they're lazy or whatever, right? So just tell us then about the group you represent, Men's Voices Ireland. So what's that group all about?
Men's Voices Ireland is a male advocacy group. It was set up early in 2016 in the absence of any representative group for men and boys, any group that would represent a whole range of issues of concern to men and boys, which didn't exist and still doesn't exist on a national basis. You'll be aware that most interest groups in society, practically all interest groups in society, have a national representative body, and these are all state funded, by the way, as well. I mean, women have several groups. One, of course, the major one is the National Women's Council. There is no counterpart for men. Other groups in society have similar representative bodies, like the LGBT people. The travellers have several national bodies, I understand it. Migrants have several. So don't have any. And that was why Men's Voices was set up to be a male advocacy group and to advocate on behalf of men and boys on issues which are of concern to men and boys, like male suicide, which was a major issue at that time. But then there are others like domestic violence, family law, education, which concerns boys, and several others as well. And that was why Men's Voice was set up, and it has been in existence since then. Although it must be said that we have received very, very little attention from the mainstream media. Despite the indifference and the lack of concern by the mainstream media, we're still here.
Wow, and so I suppose what you just mentioned too, there's several different groups who seem to have this kind of attention. So, and we talked about the virtue of in the last show, this about compassion being an overarching virtue, and this is the age of equality and so on. But obviously, it doesn't apply in certain ways. So you've got groups for all those protected oppressed groups, but none for males at all.
That's right. There are no groups for men, and this is not just peculiar to Ireland. This happens right across the Western world. Men are deemed to be the lowest of the low, the bottom of the barrel. Their concerns are not worthy of consideration. That is the main issue about it. And as a result, the outcomes for men across a whole range of social indicators have been bad or very bad. Like family law, for instance, the outcomes for men are very poor. And violence, for instance, the support services for men are pathetic in the extreme. And this is the outcome of that neglect and that indifference, even hostility, I would say, in many cases.
Yeah, you mentioned it there about, that things really haven't changed within the system and so on. No one seems to be paying attention, and we couldn't expect it that they were going to do that. But in terms of, say, any of your communications or interactions with people in the general public, or even with dealing with men in particular, dealing with their struggles, have you seen a shift at all there in attitudes? Has anyone kind of caught on that the whole system seems to be biased towards females?
Well, it's probably true to say that quite a few people have cottoned on. But as far as seeing any action in that area, that's a very different thing. You see, it seems to us that, and this is apparent across a whole range of areas, and journalism is one other area where it is apparent, there's a great fear of coming out and opposing let's say, the official narrative on a whole range of issues. people are afraid to speak their minds because they might get wrapped across the knuckles, or because certain groups might come down upon them, or because they might be told that, it's not good for your career to mention these kinds of things. That appears to be the case in journalism, and is as well.
To kind of help lay the foundations here a little bit more, I'm just trying to cater to people who, because, admittedly, because of what we were just talking about, a lot of people would be kind of shocked to hear that there are issues with males that need to be kind of addressed and that haven't been addressed. So what would you say to play not devil's advocate here, but just to throw something else at you? What would you say to people who might use a kind of a stereotype in a way and say, why should we be concerned about males or men's rights? Aren't they supposed to be tougher, in equal measure?
Well, because if men and boys are neglected, then it's not just men and boys that will suffer. It's the whole of society that will suffer. For instance, in the case of family law, if concerns of men are not catered to in family law, and if the outcomes for men in the family law courts are uniformly poor, then that's going to affect the children of that family. It's going to affect the family itself. And we need vibrant families. We need strong families in order to have a vital and vibrant society, I would say.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, great points. And, that's kind of tying into what we were discussing before. If any one group is being neglected and there's these double standards, it's not as if the damage or harm is contained to that group. There's obviously knock-on effects because they form a society. And, we were talking about the effects of feminism and so on, which we can expand on later, that, the imbalances that created by ignoring one group affects us all and so on. But to jump into the list of the kind of topics we were talking about, so we mentioned in the last show about domestic abuse figures. Is that something else that kind of you think has kind of failed to reach the general public, that the stereotype that it's all one way? Whenever we hear of gender-based violence or domestic violence, straight away it triggers up images of the wife beater, right? The man or the male attacking the female. Has there been any change in this area as well, do you think, in terms of awareness?
There possibly have been, but it's almost as though they're subterranean, they're subliminal. They haven't made an appearance to the general public. They're not than overt. But there is more of a recognition now that men also are victims of domestic violence. In actual fact, I can actually talk about that a little later when we get on to the third national strategy on domestic violence. But there is more of a recognition. But it's almost as though they're afraid to put it out in the public domain, if you like. They're almost afraid to make it into a program which will appear on television or will be heard by the general public. It's part of this what I might call fear that I mentioned a moment ago, that there is a fear of actually challenging the official narrative on a whole range of issues, and domestic violence is one of them. The official narrative on domestic violence has been for years and years, for decades in fact, that it's one way, that it consists of male perpetrators and female victims. And there is an enormous reluctance to challenge that narrative. That's the problem.
You mentioned in our correspondence, we were talking about the organization International Alliance DAVIA, Domestic Abuse and Violence and International Alliance, formed in 2001. So what's their kind of role, and would you say that are they an unbiased or a biased kind of source of information on this subject?
No, this has been one of the major positive developments of recent years in relation to issues of concern to men and boys. The International Alliance DAVIA, which the AVIA, which stands for Domestic Abuse and Violence International Alliance, it came about in 2021 through the good work of a person in America, in Washington, the USA. And it has since grown by leaps and bounds. It is an alliance of mostly men's groups, but not altogether men's groups. There are some mixed groups involved as well, men's involved. But it has been an alliance of such groups. And there are now something like 140 groups globally who are allied in this alliance. And this event, because it has shown the different groups like Men's Voices in Ireland, it has shown us that we are part of something bigger. We are not alone. We have allies in other countries. And DAVIA has provided what you might call an information and database for all sorts of things. For instance, for figures for surveys on domestic violence, articles on domestic violence, which might appear in Spain or UK, but it brings them all together in one center, and so that these can be accessed by different groups around the world. So we're all more aware of what's going on internationally now in this area, and it gives us strength, it gives us more competence, and it makes our case all the stronger when we go to argue these cases before politicians, for instance, before, say, Oireachtas committees and so on, if we get that far. It makes our case all the stronger when we put the existence of this group DAVIA before such committees. It makes our case all. And DAVIA is active since it began. To give you just an idea, I mean, you'll be aware that November 25th is International Day for the prevention of violence against women. That was instituted by the UN many years ago. Well, DAVIA wrote to the UN, and more particularly, it wrote to UN Women, which is the umbrella which actually brought about this event. And it asked them, would they include men in the International Day for the prevention of violence? They didn't even get a response, not to mind an argument. Yeah. So DAVIA is not content to stand back from these issues. You know, it's going forward, and it's quite combative. So in response, it said, we'll organize November the 18th as the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Men. And that's what they've done.
Great. And I'm just reading, I just took a piece off their website here. I was saying, domestic abuse and domestic violence have become topics of vigorous public debate in which the claims of gender activists, and there's a few bullet points, diverge dramatically from the findings of hundreds of research studies which show that men and women engage in domestic violence at similar levels. So basically they're refuting what we know is feminist propaganda, saying that it's all one way and that the data reflects that it's a bit of back and forth, and both groups can engage in that. Any comments on that?
Yeah, exactly. They have done this, and they made the case for men much stronger by telling groups like us. Are you aware of the fact that there are something like 18 covering domestic violence in Europe, for instance, in European countries? We weren't aware of that, but now we are, and we can quote these articles in defense of our case, and to further our case. These are the kinds of things that, for instance, the DAVIA has also instituted a campaign against the Istanbul Convention. In that respect, there was a major event occurred only last January when the Senate of the Czech Republic debated the Istanbul Convention for 7 hours. And they took a vote and was against instituting or ratifying the ratification of the Istanbul Convention after a huge debate.
That's great, yeah.
Oh yeah, it is, yeah. And they brought out facts about the Istanbul Convention, which we hadn't actually noticed ourselves. So we are getting more insight into what's happening in a whole lot of areas because of the fact that DAVIA exists, and because of the fact that different groups in the Czech Senate, the group that took the action against the Istanbul Convention and canvassed the senators of the Czech Republic, called the Traditional Family Association in the Czech Republic, and they set up a petition for citizens to sign, and they got 146,000 signatures. So that's an example of what's coming out of this international alliance. It's very, very strong. But I'll give you another example, since we're talking about domestic violence. One of the developments in Ireland in the last few years, first of all, the Istanbul Convention was ratified, and it is now part of the law of the Irish state. It was ratified and brought into existence in 2019. So that's there now. The Istanbul Convention is in effect in Ireland. But in 2022, the Minister for Justice, she launched the third national strategy on domestic, sexual, and gender-based violence. Now, the second national strategy was coming to an end, and it needed to be replaced by a new strategy.
Like a little top up.
So a top up, yeah. So she launched the third strategy in 2022. But unfortunately, the third strategy was badly handled from the very, very start. To give you a sense of what happened, in 2021, the minister set up an executive group which would draft the third strategy, which would essentially draft the outlines of the third strategy, and which would thereafter, if you like, compass the skeleton of it, the main issues. It might be tweaked in various ways afterwards, but this was supposed to be the core, the framework of it. To draft this strategy, she set up a three-person committee, a three-person group, executive group. It consisted of a person from the National Women's Council, a person from Safe Ireland, which is another radical feminist group, and the third person was from the Department of Justice. So, an appalling decision.
Yeah,
Utterly appalling decision. There was no, if you like, international expert on domestic violence who might have been formed part of the executive group. Not to mention that there was no one from Men's Aid, shall we say, a group representative of men. No,
yeah.
that didn't happen. So
Typical.
the outcome of that was the third strategy is fatally flawed from the very beginning, because it's based on the Istanbul Convention, completely and utterly based on the Istanbul Convention, which is itself flawed anyway. So that's the first thing. But in February, the Minister for Justice launched a new agency. Now, because prior to this, the activities of domestic violence and around domestic violence and the groups which coordinated the policy in domestic violence were not actually part of one department. They were divided between different departments. The management was fragmented, if you like. So the minister, and this was a positive development, instituted a new agency called CUAN. And CUAN was launched in February 2024. And it's located within the Department of Justice. So that's on the day that she launched it. She wrote an article which appeared in the Irish Independent on that day, which was an article about CUAN and about enlarging upon what CUAN would do. But almost the first thing she said, or she gave in that article, were figures for the distribution of domestic violence worldwide. And she said that 4 out of 7 women worldwide will experience domestic, sexual, or gender-based violence at some time in her.
4 out of 7.
4 out of 7. And then she said 3 out of 7 men will experience domestic, sexual, or gender-based violence at some point in their lives. Now, this is the first time that we heard an admission that the figures for men were quite considerable, you know?
Right.
I mean, this is a very considerable figure. 3 out of 7 victims of domestic violence are male. That's a quiet admission by the minister. That was a quiet admission by the minister that the scale of male victimization is very substantial indeed. That was the first time, it seems to me, that it was admitted. But the follow-up was negligible. The follow-up was zero, because she gave figures then for the number of reports of domestic violence received by Women's Aid in the preceding year, and then she gave figures for the number of victims' reports from Men's Aid in the same year, and there was no comparison. The figures for women were far, far greater, 3 or 4 times greater. You see, so there was a disparity immediately there, and the question could be asked: well, why aren't the figures for men much higher? And of course, the answer is that Men's Aid get about 1% of the funding that's given to women's groups, about 1%, and that's the reality of the support services for males in this republic of ours. That's the reality. So on the one hand, she admitted that the scale, the magnitude of the victimization of men, and on the other, it was sort of played down or ignored or denied. So that's where we're at, in a sense. This government can't seem to be able to admit that it has actually made mistakes in the past. That's part of the problem, it seems to us. That was the outcome for Cohen. But in relation to domestic violence, I'd like to say something else. There has been another major development, which only happened exactly 1 year ago. 1 year ago, DAVIA reported to all its affiliates that Denmark had decided to give the same amount of money of domestic as to female services. It would grant services for men and women. And in doing so, it admitted that men had been badly neglected in the past and that it was now intended to make up for this neglect. And they said further that up to now, there have been no refuges for male victims of domestic violence, but now we're going to set up refuges for male victims on the same basis as for women. It's an extraordinary development. Of course, I don't recall seeing anything about it in the mainstream media. But if you look at the Third National Strategy for Domestic Sexual and Gender-Based Violence, one of its aims is to double the number of refuges, but they're all for women only.
Well, I think of it, what was your reaction? Because I'm looking at the other bullet points from the DAVIA's website, and it mentions what was your thoughts of during the whole COVID's 1984? I have to give it a code name. The whole COVID's lockdowns. They were, how they like to combine propaganda. So they were saying that the lockdowns are causing a spike in domestic violence. So to me, all I heard was they were just using that whole situation to just kind of push another bit of feminist propaganda, which, is obviously mentioned on the news, the 6 o'clock news, everybody hears it, but there's not a shred of evidence behind it or anything. Do you think that comes from RTE, or did someone at Women's Aid give them a call and say, you wouldn't mind slipping this in, would you?
Yeah, I know that DAVIA have come out and said that they've tried to counter what they call propaganda around the lockdown, the COVID lockdown in 2021. They've tried to say that the so-called spikes in domestic violence which occur do not have a sufficient foundation. I would be very slow to say the same thing, because the Gardaí actually produced figures which did show a spike. So you would have to be able to argue that the Gardaí falsified their figures before you could say that these things are without foundation. So I would be very slow to counter it right away. I would have to look far more closely at the figures that the Gardaí produced. But the only point you could make on that score is that the Gardaí mainly depend on their figures from Women's Aid.
Yeah.
But I don't know if they actually asked Men's Aid for any evidence of a spike in their figures. So it could be that they're operating on the basis of faulty data. I would be reluctant to make any further statements in that regard.
No worries, but it does, we can come back to this a bit later when we're talking about ideology and stuff, but it does kind of remind us of this whole thing that, whether you're talking about rape or domestic violence or other issues that the feminists usually like to talk about, the ones who are really mostly interested in talking about that stuff from their, on a big scale from their point of view traditionally is always them. Like, they're the ones, gathering the data. They're the ones politically motivated. Well, previously, they're the ones previously motivated to gather all the information. And then when you get like a group like the Guards or someone else needs to act on certain things, who do they go to? Well, if the only ones holding all the figures are activists and they're ideologically biased, that causes a big problem, doesn't it?
Oh, of course, yeah. Obviously, it causes a huge problem. So another thing that has to be addressed is what you might call the way feminist discourse has invaded all agencies in the state, including the Gardaí, has to be said. Well, they also have been affected by the feminist ideology on domestic violence, because Women's Aid have been giving so-called training to the Gardaí. You know that the Gardaí now have these protective services units now within different divisions of the Garda, which cater for domestic violence cases almost exclusively.
Yeah.
Well, the Gardaí in those protective services units were trained by Women's Aid. I mean, so obviously there's a bias there. There's a bias. It's undeniable.
Going to the next the item then, the parental alienation thing, right? So before we kind of dissect that a little bit, can you define for us what that is?
Parental alienation is the condition which it arises almost exclusively of harmonious breakdown of a relationship between two parents, and it often has to do with disparate children. Condition in which one parent tries to alienate the child or the children against the other parent. It's against the parent without with no good reason for it. To try to poison in order that the custody of that child will be given to that person. It's not only a crime against the child, it's child abuse, but it's also an abuse of the other adult who is concerned as well. So it's a doubly pernicious form of abuse, domestic abuse. It's a major form of domestic abuse, but it has only become a major in the last 40 years. I think it was only in the 1980s who originated the concept of parental alienation began to write articles about it in academic journals. That's when it started to take off. But it was issue right now. It's and you might say between ideology and empirical science. Parental alienation is growing all the time. And there are many, many groups now across the world which declare that parental alienation is it's exclusively the feminist groups that oppose it. Almost exclusively, the feminist groups say that it's not real. They denounce parental alienation. What they call a pseudo-scientific concept, or a much discredited concept, is what they call it.
Typical.
Yeah, but the war is now going on not only at the level of states, where departments of justice or departments of children, whatever, are actually concerned about whether or not this exists and whether there should be legislation enacted in order to take account of it. It's happening even beyond that at the UN level. It's extraordinary. The UN Human Rights Council has become the focus of a huge battle on parental alienation right now.
Right.
A year, maybe 2 years ago, that feminists have launched a global effort to discredit the concept of parental alienation. Part of that global effort is centered at the UN Human Rights Council. Because what happened was, there was the UN Human Rights Council on different issues, and one of them is domestic abuse. And the special rapporteur on domestic violence or abuse is a woman named Reem Al-Salam. And she was asked to draw up a report. And she produced a report which came out in June of 2023. And Violence Against Women and Violence Against Children was the title of the report. In order to produce this report, she was asked by the Human Rights Council to collect information from any and all sources worldwide on the violence, and that scores of organizations in many, many countries across the world of parents who come together to talk about parental alienation, to have it recognized as a very real condition. Hundreds of them. There are hundreds of such groups worldwide, and there are hundreds of academics and experts worldwide who are also investigating parental alienation and writing papers and reports on it, doing research on it.
Yeah.
And this report was denounced in the most ferocious terms. Let me see. It said that the report by this woman ignored a comprehensive review by trusted and reliable academics, which described parental alienation research as having a scientifically trustworthy knowledge base. In drawing up a report, she only included data from those who said domestic violence is not, or parental alienation is not a real thing. And she's totally ignored the huge amount of reports which came from groups which said it was, including a report from Alienated Children First in Ireland. Ireland has a group called ACF, which is a group of concerned people, parents and others, who's concerned about parental alienation, and their report was simply ignored as well.
This is typical, isn't it? The kind of the same pattern when they're creating propaganda. They just keep the information that they like and ignore the rest.
It's quite extraordinary. I mean, it's outrageous in the extreme. The group called PASG, which is Parental Alienation Study Group, who drew up this denunciation of the Al-Salam report, they came together with another group called Global Action for Research Integrity in Parental Alienation, and they produced a 70-page denunciation of the Reem Al-Salam report.
Wow.
And they use the most strongest language you can imagine, misinformation, deliberately ignoring scientific evidence and all that stuff. And these groups, like the PASG group, Parental Alienation Study Group, consists of 900 members in 65 countries. So I mean, this is a reputable group. You can't simply ignore a group of that size, you know. And the other one is similar, as I understand it. Global Action for Research Integrity in Parental Alienation is an international non-profit organization that investigates and corrects scientific fraud that relates to parental alienation. And they said the bias of this report is apparent in a whole lot of ways. It relies completely on anti-PA submissions and ignores the submissions from the proponents of PA, parental alienation. It fails to disclose the content of thousands of submissions that were made. It relies on the opinions and assumptions of critics instead of scientific evidence. And it fails to acknowledge the life experiences of those who have been victims of PA. They end up by saying, these errors are so egregious that we've been a deliberate attempt to mislead mental health professionals, legal professionals, and policymakers. The Human Rights Council was due to debate and to consider this report by Reem Al-Salam at its meeting last July. DAVIA, in advance of that gathering or meeting of the Human Rights Council, they issued 8 press releases against it. And they had them translated into languages, all sorts of languages, and they were issued by the different affiliate groups in all the different countries as well, to their own ambassadors to the UN. When the Human Rights Council met in July last year, it did not approve Reem Al-Salam's report. On the other hand, the report still exists. It still exists on the UNHRC website. The fact that it wasn't accepted, it still exists there. Others have been calling to be removed because it's so misleading and so fraudulent. That's the position with regard to parental alienation. There's a war going on. By the way, only 2 weeks ago, Romania passed an anti-alienation law. It recognizes parental alienation as a fact, and it has legislated against it. And Romania is the 4th country, I think. It joins Brazil, Mexico, and India, which have also instituted laws against parental alienation. That's in relation to parental alienation. But as you can see, it has in common features which belong to a whole lot of other separate, being another one, the dispute about scientific evidence versus ideology being the main involved here.
Yeah, that's a constant theme in my work. I suppose since I spoke to you last, I've decided to focus on Marxism and Marxist indoctrination quite a lot. And it's one of those subjects that once you learn, or sorry, Marxist activism as well. And once you learn to kind of see it, you tend to see it everywhere. And that's a common theme. Even recently, I've been involved in debating spaces on X or Twitter. And you have, whenever you're dealing with these fundamentalist ideologues, as you called them before, they tend to, they'll quote science and fact, quote unquote, but it's usually just information created by someone else who's also brainwashed or trying to push an agenda, and they will ignore actual empirical evidence that comes from other sources that doesn't say what they want it to say. And then you have I noticed with the feminist groups in Ireland, they might quote, one of them will say, "Oh, according to facts produced by the UN, UNESCO or something else, this is what the story is." And what they're doing is they're just quoting other people who are on the same page as them. Unfortunately, that technique, I think, works on people. So you're talking about the UN there. They will leave that article up even though it's already been destroyed and disproved. They'll leave it up there because it still has some kind of propaganda value.
Yeah, unfortunately, that is that is a problem. It's well known, this issue. These they cite each other. They'll cite an article, comments of each other. So it's to create scientific empirical basis, but it's an illusion. There is no real evidence there at all. That has been noticed in research on domestic abuse, domestic violence, quite a bit of thing. If you look, for instance, Women's Aid and some of their latest reports, reduced to quoting from reports which were issued 10 years ago because they can't find anything more modern or more recent to support what they're saying. Whereas the evidence on domestic violence that is scientific is coming out every year, and it's consistent. It's consistent in that the evidence are in the conclusions, which are each other in a broad sort of way, broad manner.
What you mentioned before as well about how you were saying that even though you had the UN on one side and their feminists, their tentacles around the world, and they're all on the same page, and you have these other groups who are actually bringing them evidence, who are involved with parental alienation, saying to them, well, that report is wrong. The fact that the feminist groups will actively, and the UN will actively obstruct any sort of awareness on this issue shows you that the whole thing is ideologically biased, And it's, to me, it's a bit of a smoking gun. And it makes me think as well, probably of course, what you would know is that the feminist groups are, that the ideology of feminism is kind of, it encourages females to use parental alienation as a sort of a weapon to get their way, in certain situations, because, somehow men deserve that treatment, back to the whole oppressor versus oppressed thing. So I think that's how they justify the bias.
Yeah, well, of course, the feminist approach is ideological in that it's not based on scientific evidence. None of the big reports or the major conventions like the Istanbul Convention against the statements that it makes. It's all based on ideology, which is that it's oppressors the oppressed. It's a Marxist, a neo-Marxist idea, that the world is divided into two groups: the oppressors on one hand, who are men, by the way, and the oppressed on the other, who are poor women, on the other hand. And this is how society is divided: oppressors versus oppressed. And power is the only power is the only motive behind the interaction, and that also is just I believe.
So let's move into the area of family law. And I mean, I remember some from our last discussion. I've heard about different, I've heard about this subject being discussed over the years, and some of the essence of this ideology and in the court system. Do you you mentioned the family courts bill family courts bill in 2022. So could you summarize that for us?
Yeah. the Family Courts Bill 2022, it's a move family court structure. When domestic violence and sorry, not domestic violence, when separation are brought to court, they are heard in the ordinary courts. But now, at long last, there is a move to set up a system of family courts in which, with family involving separation and divorce of children, maintenance, and such issues. And this is a move which is long overdue, and it's a standard practice in many countries, as I understand it now, to have family courts. So the idea will be to set up a family district court, a family circuit court, and even a family high court. And this is parallel to the where we know about common practice. That's the idea between the family courts. Family Courts Act, and it's a good idea. It's a good and of 2017, the Mediation Act of 2017 sought to replace the adversary with a more conciliatory process, such as mediation. You probably wouldn't be aware that in 2019. There were hearings before the Oireachtas Justice Committee on reform of the... And actually, Men's Voices took part in that. It's one of the very few occasions when we got any kind of recognition. We made an appearance before the Oireachtas Committee on reform of 2019, where we argued about the court system being of disputes involving family breakdown and separation and divorce, because in the courts are simply an arena of conflict, conflict lawyers, and the two are absolutely set totally against each other when it comes to a conflict with the courts. It's a winner-take-all approach, if you like. That's what it's about. Winner take all. The aim was to try to introduce a better way of resolving disputes, in family disputes over children, over family home, over family. So, Family Mediation Act has now the Family Courts Act. I think to try to advance the mediation process by requiring at least that. Before people go to court, before people go to even before the family court, they seek first of all to resolve their problem before a mediator, and they seek to have a resolution there. And the emphasis on that process is that it's on conciliation. We try to conciliate each other to the things that are, because both of us to have the best outcomes for their children. The welfare of their children is first and foremost when a family relationship breaks down. And also two parties will want to fulfill their obligations and their responsibilities as parents in the most meaningful manner possible as well. And that's what mediation does. It tries to emphasize the positive, the factors which we have in common rather than what divides us. And so it's still before the Oireachtas. It hasn't become enacted in law as yet, but hopefully it will become enacted in law. When it does, it will expedite the process of addressing disputes and resolution of disputes, and that it will look for a better outcome of disputes. It won't be, if you like, conflict coming out of it. The two parties will try to agree amicably on what the outcome should be. That's what it's for. And it has been emphasized during those hearings that it was families must be dealt with at the very earliest stage at local level. Just as soon as there appears to be the conflict is arising or the possibility of breakdown is arising, that the problem should be addressed as early as possible, the best possible outcome. And only If that is not successful, then should the dispute be taken to the court at the lowest possible court as quickly as possible. And the lowest possible court is the district court. And part of the problem up to now in regard to family disputes and has been, it's enormously costly. It's enormously expensive for people and have barristers. It's enormously costly. The costs are phenomenally high, and very few people can afford them. But the costs at the district court level are much lower, much lower, and that's part of the philosophy behind the current reform. I believe is that the district court should be used as much as possible, so as to reduce and the cost to the people involved as much as possible.
You know, the court system or the kind of judgments on family breakup tend to be a little bit more like favouring the female. Do you think this new sort of system will actually help to make that a bit more fair, or will it keep it the same? And because part of my brain thinks, well, who's kind of pushing for these changes? Usually the ones pushing for it are motivated ideologically to help the females. So how do you think what this is gonna result in?
Oh no, I wouldn't say that. No, I would say that the people who are pushing for the changes in the family courts, everybody seems to be involved, including men in particular, men who have actually been disadvantaged by court judgments in the past. They are pushing for reform of the family courts. This is called at the international level. The findings have been that setting up of family courts in many countries have greatly helped to reduce conflict and to bring about more conciliatory outcomes when there is a breakdown. And most people are in favor of this, particularly men are in favor of it. I suppose we can hope that it will be better. The outcomes will be better for men. One of the features that has been hearings that I was talking about earlier was that by quite a number of people who made representations at those hearings. Parity of treatment for both parents was one of the requirements. So I think it would be much more difficult to neglect that or to ignore that kind of treatment in future and when the new courts are in operation. The idea is to have judges trained in family law, because the operation up to now has been dreadful. The judges who are adjudicating on cases about family and breakdown families have not been trained properly in family law. They haven't been trained on it, and many of them have disliked it intensely. That has been brought out by people like Roisin O'Shea, who wrote a magnificent thesis on this some years ago. That she sat in on court cases, hundreds of court cases to do with family law, right across district and circuit courts. And she said that one thing that was striking was how judges did not like it. They absolutely disliked it. And that's partly because they weren't trained in family law. So they have to be, the new family courts will only be adjudicated on by judges who are trained in that area and who have voluntarily chosen to participate in this kind of family court procedure. So the hope is that the outcomes in these courts will be reform that has been called for, is that these family district courts should have access to child view experts when the case comes up about the welfare of a child. Another issue that arises is hearing the child's point of view when there is a family breakdown. The child's point of view is important now. the extra being more and more important to hearing what the child has to say. Because, of course, the child may spend more time with one parent than the other after the proceedings are over. That might be the judgment. Another part of the issue, the outcome, is that both parents, as I say, should be treated equally, which means that both parents should have equal joint access to the child. So the child should spend as equal amounts of time with both parents. That should be an outcome of the family court procedure. That should be an great gain. That would be a great step forward, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, hopefully that manifests, absolutely. Let's move into the area of, we were talking about the 2017 things like sexual assault, consent, and so on. So what kind of what effect did that Act 2017 Act have on the landscape, do you think?
Oh yeah, that had a major effect on the landscape. Act 2017, it dealt with rape and consent. I want to mention a related issue. The prosecution law has become common. You've often heard about the phrase victim-centered. Our procedures must be victim-centered. You probably heard about it.
Yeah.
It's quite common in the US. In 2018, over 150 American criminal lawyers, law professors, and scholars, they signed an open letter denouncing what they called the victim-centered investigative practices which flourished in. And they were alluding in what Title IX investigations. I don't know whether you've heard about Title.
No, actually, no.
There was something called campus rape culture. You probably heard about that phrase at some point. Yeah. That was drummed up to be a huge issue by the feminists in the Obama years. Campus rape culture. It's supposed to be absolutely hugely prevalent on American campuses, that women in their 4 years, they had stood a very high chance of being sexually assaulted or even raped. I think that the figures that they gave varied between 20% and 25%, depending on who you're talking to. The 20%, at least 20% of them would be criminally assaulted, sexually assaulted. Of course, the real figures were not anywhere in the vicinity of that. That was complete rubbish. And again, it was by feminists. It was another instance of the way they kind of beat the drum and drum up support. Actually, Obama quoted their figures in when he was speaking in public by the feminists, that 20% a woman on campus on a campus in the US in her 4 years, it stood as something like a 20% chance of being criminally assaulted, sexually assaulted. Total lie, complete lie. But in response to that, Obama instituted what are known as investigations on campus. So instead of actually being invoked if there was a sexual assault committed, the authorities on campus set up their own courts, set up their own court procedures to adjudicate sexually assaulted or not. And the of justice was appalling. They didn't even, in some cases, there was no such thing as due process. In many cases, the man who was charged with an offense wasn't even told what offense he was being charged with. That's a preliminary of a preliminary step in due process. Wasn't even told. He wasn't allowed to question the person who made the accusation against him. He wasn't allowed to question her. And hundreds and hundreds of youth expelled from campuses on the basis of these kangaroo courts. Now there have been hundreds and hundreds of victories secured against US campuses for having expelled students of false evidence or trumped up charges. Anyway, the open letter was addressing, in large measure, not entirely, but in large measure, it was addressing these victim-centered investigative practices. And one of the statement they came out, one of the statements in their letter was, by their very name, their ideology, and the methods they foster, believe the victim concepts, presume the guilt of an accused, and threaten to subvert constitutionally rooted due process protections. Now, these kind of victim-centered investigations are not confined to campus. The notion of a victim-centered investigation it has taken place here. The victim-centered investigations is the use of the word victim to describe a complainant before a trial has even taken place, and in the course of the trial itself. Of victim to describe this has been taking place wholesale, actually, in Irish courts and in reports in Irish newspapers. And would you believe it? The Victims of Crime Act 2017 actually instituted this in law, if you don't mind that. The Victims of Crime Act 2017 says victim is defined and declared independent of. So a person can be labeled or designated victim without any offence having to be established. And this is in the Victims of Crime Act 2017. If you read it, you'll find it there.
It's crazy.
It's appalling. Yeah, of course it is appalling. It's an appalling abuse of due process because it prejudices the case against the accused person.
Yeah.
And it declares that the victim, the complainant, already a victim before the trial has actually come to an end.
So then that would have an impact on, decision at the end of like that.
Of course, it's bound to influence the jury. If the jury are sitting in on a serious sexual assault case, and the person who is making the accusation, the complainant, is habitually described as a victim, and then it prejudices the case against the accused person. The accused person, in the mind of the jury, is already been convicted, if you like. This practice has been warned against by several eminent lawyers. I'll give you one instance. King's Counsel, who is the chair of our association, as early as 2017, she said this is going to lead to I believe it has happened in Ireland as well, that eminent people in Ireland have warned against it. As far as I know, the Victims of Crime Act still act and changed. That act is still there, and to rape prior to 2017, the Sexual Offences Act 2017, in the public mind, rape was associated with violence. It was an action whereby a woman was plucked off the street or accosted in a lonely place by a complete stranger, who then forced her into having sex. That was the public's notion of rape. But the Sexual Offences Act 2017, introducing the notion of consent and stipulating what constitutes consent. So what has happened now is that, as a result of this law, very well know each other. There need be no violence at all. And all that is involved is whether or not, when intimacy took place, whether or not it involves consent. And that's that's where the issue is now.
So it's a different thing entirely, yeah.
Yeah, it's very different, yeah. So the 2017 Act laid down a couple of sentences from it, a couple of phrases from it. It says, a person consents if he or she freely and voluntarily agrees to engage in that act. And then it goes on in the second, the second provision, the second clause in that it says, and there are various possibilities. If force was used on that person, obviously, or the threat of force was used, then that person could not consent. And another possibility because of the effect of alcohol or some other drug. And yet another possibility is if the person was asleep and the act took place while the person was asleep. But clause 4 of the act says this: consent to a sexual act may be withdrawn at any time before the act begins, or in the case of a continuing act, while the act is taking place. And clause 5 says, any failure or omission on the part of a person to offer resistance to an act does not of itself constitute consent to that act. So now this, they're problematic areas anyway.
Yeah.
Clauses 4 and 5 can give rise to problems. Suppose one party is initially willing. How is the other to be sure that this continues, not make any resistance?
Yeah.
Since it cannot be assumed that silence does not imply consent. So how is if the first person continues to be willing to engage, if the person doesn't say anything?
Yeah, it's crazy. So every second you're supposed to sign a contract every single second to make sure it's still okay.
Yeah, and the kind of ludicrous things arise, like how many consents must one party get from the other to be on the safe side? And this is the kind of ludicrous stuff that arises out of it. A major factor is that a woman is not, let's say a woman is not required to say no. She does not consent to having sex. She's not required to say no. Why? I don't know. I just don't know this act to answer. But there are many other things that arise out of it naturally. One of them is that there can be a subtle shifting of the burden of proof to the man to prove he did have consent. If the woman says she didn't give consent, and she's not required to, as we just said, there can be enough proof to the man to prove that he did have consent.
Yeah.
And that's a denial of due process. It's up to the prosecution to prove that did not have consent. Up to the prosecution to prove that. It's not up to the man to prove he did. That's a major element of due process. One of the major principles of due process is that a person is presumed innocent until it's a major plank of the system that we know as due process. And in these cases, one can see a shifting of that burden of proof. The woman who apparently gave her consent the night before can change her mind next morning and bring a rape charge against the man.
God, it's crazy.
And she can still bring such a charge at some indefinite point in the future. If she, on reflection, she believes that she did not give.
So she retroactively gives non-consent to something that happened.
That's what is being said. I mean, this arose in the outrageous case about Micheál Ó Lane, the broadcaster who was sentenced to 18 months in jail there a couple of years ago. This is a well-known case where the woman was actually in his bed. She was naked. She was in his bed, and when he pressed himself on her, she immediately objected. And he backed off, but he still got 18 months, you know.
Oh my God.
A further, as if that's not bad enough, a further complicating factor arises when alcohol is present.
Yeah, that's a big one.
That's the big one, because when alcohol is present, the whole matter becomes much more complicated, because we know that alcohol is a disinhibitor. People will, under the influence of alcohol, will do things they might normally do. But it also makes them forget what actually happened. So a person could conceivably sort of say, "Oh, I was under the influence of alcohol. I don't remember actually. I didn't give consent."
Oh God, yeah, it's crazy.
And yet another factor that arises is the way responsibility is allocated. What happens? But a man who is intoxicated is held responsible. Despite his intoxication, he's held responsible.
The old double standards again.
It's double standards again, yeah. It's double standards again, yeah. There actually has been something of a kickback, if it could be called that, in the last couple of years. And the kickback is actually coming. I don't know whether you're aware of a book called Revolution. Yeah, yeah. Her name was Louise Perry. She wrote that book a couple of years ago. Actually, she has impeccable credentials because she was something of a feminist, and she worked in helping victims of abuse at one point in her career. So her credentials are pretty strong. But she wrote this book, The Case Against the Sexual Revolution, and she now maintains that the sexual revolution has been harmful to women. One of the things that she says in this book is that consent workshops have little value, which is quite amazing because we're all supposed to be getting consent workshops now. Every student is supposed to be subjected to required to undertake consent workshops now. She said they have little value. And she made a number of other deprecatory remarks about what's going on in these cases, including the fact that feminists, she says, have backed themselves into a corner as far as rape is concerned. And I'm not quite sure what she actually meant by that. Again, it's something that caught my eye.
Do you mean maybe she kind of, they've probably pushed this so far now that they're kind of exposed with the ludicrous kind of levels of control they're bringing in and the double standards, etc. Maybe is that?
Well, I don't know, but you'll probably be aware that people who do surveys of sexual activity particularly among young people, have been saying that sexual activity among young people has been on the decline for many years. And it's now, across the Western world, it's supposed to be at a lower level than it was in the 1960s.
Amazing.
And we were told in Ireland in the 1960s, we were suffering from huge sexual repression, This is the stuff. And now, apparently, sex is much rarer than it was 40, 50 years ago.
That's pretty symbolic, isn't it? Because
it is, yeah. Oh, yeah. Spain, for instance, there was a notorious law passed in Spain, Domestic Violence Act, passed in Spain in 2004 by a socialist government there. And it's an appalling law. But they have tracked the decline of marriage in Spain since that law was passed. It's fascinating to see how strong the correlation is. Very, very strong correlation. Men are now not inclined to get married, much less than another Europe, being related to this law, that this is the reason. And groups in Spain, there are groups in Spain. There's one group in Spain, which I've come to know through DAVIA, this group called Elevate. They've been very, very active. They've produced some astonishing work, reports. And they came out with reports saying that since the act was passed in 2004, something like this, of domestic violence had been brought before Spanish, 2 million. They said that 1.7 million were found to be devoid of content. They weren't proved. I don't know whether it's possible to say that these people were innocent. The Elevate would say these people were innocent. But the point I'm making is that 75% of cases, charges of domestic violence against men, 70% were proved to be without foundation.
That's massive.
That's extraordinary. I mean, that's unbelievable.
Like indicative of hatred.
It is, yeah. It is. Absolutely. Absolutely. It is. It can be, it said mean something else. And have looked at the figures for the rate of decline in marriage in Spain, and they have correlated it with this act, with this law. So the decline in sexual activity is having a bad effect in all sorts of ways. It's destroying families, it's destroying society.
This is the kind of, it's at moments like this, and I put on my tinfoil hat here for a moment, but when you look at this ideology, well, we know it's Marxism, but when I explain to other people, sometimes I just call it crazy revolutionary activism. And it seems to be like its ulterior motive is always destruction, and always has this facade of virtue signaling. It's about women's rights or trans rights or whatever, migrant rights or whatever it is. But the ultimate, the sum of all its impact is always negative in the end. And it's just, even though, like, say, the next thing I was going to talk to you about is, like, the kind of hypersexualization of society in so many ways. But it's amazing that on the one hand, there's the hypersexualization of young people and so on, and again, the United Nations pushing this weird sexual education initiatives and programs, but still the end result at the end is that people aren't really coming together, having stable relationships that last, and having kids. It's really
That's right.
extraordinary.
That's it. That's the end result. It's purely destructive. That is something that DAVIA argued. By the way, should I mention, DAVIA, I said, are quite combative. Only last month, DAVIA to New York City, they held a press conference. There were a number of them there, members from from across the US, but from others as well. They held a press conference, and then they held a vigil outside the offices of UN Women. Can you believe it? They held a vigil outside the offices of UN Women, with whom they have.
That's great.
They participated in another conference, and the title of it was Conference on Women, and it was supposed to emphasize women and the importance of family. And DAVIA at that conference. And they caught from these at that conference. Because they brought home the way men did in so many different ways today. They brought home to that conference. And but as I say, DAVIA is constantly emphasizing the importance of family, the maintenance of family and strengthening of family, and the importance of measures which strengthen family. And this is a major theme with DAVIA and with the groups that participate in it, which is a very constructive aim when you think of the destructiveness.
Say, as our kind of final kind of item here, in terms of, say, how we could improve the situation in Ireland with regards to that imbalance we were talking about, starting to safeguard, particularly young men, I think, because they're obviously growing up with no frame of reference, no life experience, and they're having to interact in this and get, go through schooling and so on, and go through this world where things are biased. And we talked about the impacts of feminism and so on. They might not be receiving the guidance that they need, and certainly not the support. So what kind of, suggestions would you what suggestions would you have as to how to kind of improve the situation in Ireland?
I find it hard to make suggestions because of the fact that publicize the kind of gatherings that men, or that the kind of events that men, like men's voices, want to take place, the kind of activities they want to, the gatherings that they want to take place, they're not taking place, and the atmosphere is still hostile. And I still don't know. An awful lot of young men are now going to the internet for advice. They're consulting Joe Rogan, for instance, and Jordan Peterson is very popular, and they're getting some. But as for things that are happening in Ireland, I'm afraid I have little enough to offer in that respect until the climate changes, until the media is replaced by a more favorable media atmosphere. I can't see how this. I mean, platforms like your own, Resolving Race, there are a number of others now. There are a number of platforms which are emerging, which are aimed at attracting young men and helping them and so on. That's about it. That's as much as I can say. Welcome to join Ben's Voices anytime. But our experience has not been a happy one in that respect. We're no stronger now than we were 6 or 7 years ago, in terms of numbers anyway. That's the grim reality of it.
Yeah, I think the ideological landscape, I always come back to that. I think that's the big thing, because once a group is kind of tarnished with that label of being the oppressor, it just starts to transform everything in a destructive way. And I mean, when I think of, say, young men, I mean, I dealt with this myself a little bit doing college courses and stuff. The environment wasn't right, and I think feminism is a big part of what's imbalanced the ship. And like, I think, you know, young men in particular, they don't have they may not understand what's kind of happening to them. You know, they might be interacting with these females and being in these environments where it's biased against them, and they're made to feel bad just simply for who they are, which is ironically, and they're being judged sometimes just simply for being male, which ironically is actually sexist as well.
Yeah, of course it is. Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, I have little to be able to add to what you're saying there. I can't really add any more, except to say that I think the climate is changing. As I say, across the world, the feminists are being challenged in a way they probably weren't before. And if you look at, say, the National Women's Council in Ireland the last couple of years, it has come in criticism. And there are now several women's groups have been set up in opposition to the National Women's Council, which is helpful, because it shows that that group is utterly unrepresentative. It shouldn't be. It should be disbanded entirely. It should be defunded. I mean, there've been several people already. That's about all I can say, really.
For the non-Irish listeners or viewers, there was the family and care referendum on the 8th of March, I think it was. And, you know, it was an effort to change the constitution, to change the definition of remove the idea of marriage from the constitution, or the idea of a woman from the constitution, or mother, sorry. And they're bringing up these terms, durable relationships. We know that the feminist groups were involved. So it's funny how these Marxist groups, they try to peg themselves off as being rebels and against the system, but yet that whole situation showed us that they were 100% complicit with the government in trying to bring in these referendum and constitutional changes, which actually worked against women in the end.
And they were utterly rejected, which is the positive thing which came out of it. They were completely rejected, and which shows again that the National Women's Council is losing ground.
Yeah, it's good. It's good that there's well, listen, David, thanks very much for your time today. It's been great getting your insights on this stuff again. So, you know, the website is mensvoicesireland.com, and you're on X as well at mensvoices_IRL. So, thanks very much for your time today, David.
Thank you, Emmett. Thank you very much. I enjoyed the conversation. Great to be able to discourse at length on all these issues. It has never happened to us in regard to the mainstream media, anyway, as you well know. So thank you very much, and good wishes with your platform.
So that was David Walsh from Men's Voices Ireland. Make sure you check out the first interview we did back in 2018, the first episode, right here on Resolving Reality Radio. The website to check out is mensvoicesireland.com. You can also find them on X at mensvoices_IRL. The links for those will be down in the description. Also check out the Resolving Reality links. We're on YouTube, X at ResolvingR, Rumble, Odysee. The email for the show is contactorr@protonmail.com, and we're on some other platforms as well. Also, you can support the show by using Buy Me a Coffee for a one-time donation. You can also sponsor us on Patreon. And finally, you can check out the Resolving Reality merch shop, which was set up recently, so go and check that out. Thanks for listening. Hopefully you'll join us in the next episode. Until next time.